And welcome. Thank you everyone for joining this defense so early today. And it's a big day for Dom and for me as well. Thank you everyone, including the committee members and also the audience, other guests. And today Dom is going to present his dissertation work on tactile device in enabling people to learn to perceive speech, but not through hearing. And we are going to see what he has done during the past 2 years. Now it's your turn, Dom.
Okay. Is my screen share coming through?
Yes.
Yep.
All right, so my title is Tactile Speech Perception with Gamified Training on the Vibey Transcribey. Human factors scientists and practitioners study people and how they interface with systems. When something goes wrong on an airplane, many people might wonder what the pilot did wrong or how the pilot failed. The human factors people will instead ask how the system failed to support the pilot. This idea correlates well with the social model of disability. Rather than thinking about how a person may be disabled and how that limits them, we should think about how their environment is failing to support them. The designers, architects, and engineers and makers of the world, with all of our modern technology and methods, should stop creating systems and environments that disable people. As a society, when inclusive design is built in from the start, everybody stands to benefit. Ideally, this mindset will be adopted in the design of every human experience. We should also keep in mind the increasingly important role of information and communication. In this age, people need access to information and the ability to communicate. Tactile communication has been suggested to be more universally accessible than printed text or spoken word. It can be used by people who are deaf or hard of hearing, people who are visually impaired, people who are deaf and blind. But it can also be used by others, like people who don't want to worry about shoulder surfers, people in noisy environments, people performing a task where their vision and hearing is already fully loaded, or even people in situations where other forms of communication may be seen as unprofessional. Tactile communication has even come up recently in the world of professional chess, where fans speculated that a cheater used a discrete tactile device to receive information from a co-conspirator. Everybody in this meeting today with a cell phone set to vibrate is using tactile communication. It's not new, but the way that we use it today is a bit crude. I'd like to dig deeper into what's possible and push the limits of tactile communication. The holy grail, so to speak, of this would be tactile speech. That is, to communicate information on the skin, which is as fast and as rich as speech. Throughout this presentation, you'll hear me say some words, and I just want to make sure that we have some basic terminology here. One thing you may hear me say is phones or phonemes or segmentals. These words just describe the vowel and consonant sounds that we combine to speak words. There are more vowel and consonant sounds than we have letters for in the English alphabet, so I use these 1 and 2 letter codes in the tables to the right to distinguish them later in the presentation. The consonant codes are mostly how you'd expect them, but the vowels are a bit tougher to decipher. But when you see these codes, just know that I'm simply referring to distinct consonant and vowel sounds. Now, speech is incredibly nuanced, so you'll also hear me talk about prosody or suprasegmentals. This refers to all of the other aspects of speech, including pitch, loudness, timing and rhythm, timbre or the quality of sound, etc. I'm not the first person to try to put speech on the skin. There have been numerous examples in both academic research and in commercial products. One way to organize these previous works is by their level of processing. On the low end of that spectrum, you have people who have simply held a speaker in their hand and tried to interpret speech. Or even more crudely, one researcher had participants speak into a 14-foot tube while somebody else held their hand on the other end of that tube. On this low end of the spectrum, speech is still sound. On the high end of the processing spectrum are symbolic displays. At this level, speech is no longer sound. Instead, it's been broken down into its constituent phonemes, and then each of those phonemes is vibrated in distinct places or patterns on the skin. Naturally, there are systems in the middle of that spectrum where different features of the audio signal are extracted and displayed. Some of them are as simple as a continuous amplitude of the audio waveform, while others extract specific frequencies, pitch, or format information for display. Systems on the low end have shown some successes in conveying prosodic elements of speech, but do little or nothing to make phonemes distinguishable for people. Meanwhile, systems on the high end convey only phonemic information and no prosody at all. But all of these systems, all of these previous works have one thing in common, and it's that they each exist in exactly one place on the spectrum. My novel approach, which I call the Vibey Transcribey, incorporates information from across the spectrum, and this is what I present to you today. With the Vibey Transcribey, I wanted to know if participants could learn to perceive tactile phonemes, if they could learn to perceive tactile prosody, and if their tactile speech perception integrated with auditory speech perception. We talked about phonemes and prosody earlier in the presentation, but that last one may need a little more explanation. There's a perceptual phenomenon known as the McGurk effect, where what you hear can be influenced by what you see. For example, if a video sequence of someone whose lips are mouthing ga, ga, ga is paired with audio of them saying ba, 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 sometimes people will hear neither the ba's going to their ears or the ga's going to their eyes. Instead, they will hear a da. This is perceptual integration at work. Our senses of hearing and seeing combine to create a single distinct perceptual experience. So that third research question is an attempt to determine whether the Vibey Transcribey creates true tactile speech perception and not just a single modality sensory experience. To answer all of these questions, I started by defining a tactile speech encoding which captures three distinct features of speech. Pre-recorded audio and a transcript is fed to a forced aligner tool, which determines the timestamps for all of the phonemes in the audio. On the device, each phoneme is mapped to a unique place on the forearm. So a B sound would be vibrated under the wrist, while an A sound would be vibrated near the elbow. The pre-recorded audio is also processed through a loudness estimation algorithm, which calculates the perceptual loudness of the audio over time. This data is used to control the intensity of the vibrations so that louder utterances have stronger feels. Pitch detection is also performed on the audio, and this is mapped to the bicep in a pitch to place paradigm. Low pitches are felt on the inside of the bicep, and increasing pitches are felt across the bicep to the outside of the arm. These three sets of samples are combined into a single binary file, which can then be sent to the Vibey Transcribey and vibrated on the wearer. Once I had that encoding scheme designed, I then built devices that would create those vibrations with that encoding. There have been multiple iterations of the hardware over the past few years. I prototyped different ways to wear the device, but ended up settling on a knit fabric sleeve. The version used in this study is seen here. I built 10 copies of this version for less than $150 USD each. The device itself is built around the ESP32, a low-cost, feature-rich microcontroller. And the vibrations come from linear resonant actuators, or LRAs, which strike a good balance between responsiveness, strength, and cost. To reduce the complexity and cost of the hardware, I took advantage of a tactile illusion called the funneling effect. The funneling effect is a tactile illusion where two vibrating stimuli, which are close enough together, are perceived as a single vibration partway between the two actual vibrations. Pitch is rendered on the bicep in a pitch to place configuration with a one-dimensional funneled array like you see in this image. But instead of two actuators for the pitch array, I have 4 actuators and an illusory site in between each one. Sorry, I just realized that my captions weren't on. I expand this idea into a two-dimensional display by arranging the actuators in a hexagonal grid. Using this method, the Vibey Transcribey phoneme array contains 42 cells using only 12 actuators. To learn how to interpret vibrations from the device, I developed a set of 4 training games that work with the Vibey Transcribey like a gaming peripheral. I do have larger videos of each of these games, but we'll save those for now in the interest of time. Each of the games worked in a similar way, though. Players controlled a character in a 3D environment. When they interacted with specific elements in the environment, they would feel a word vibrate on the Vibey Transcribey. They then had to choose their next action in the game based on what they believed the word was and interact with the environment accordingly. They received immediate feedback on whether or not their response was correct, which included earning points for correct responses and losing points for incorrect ones. They repeated this process as many times as they could before a 3-minute timer expired. With the materials completed, I could finally put them to use to address my research question. The procedure for answering these questions started with bringing participants into the lab for a set of pre-tests, which I'll explain in detail soon. These tests take about 2 hours in person, but the pre-tests altogether actually took several weeks due to COVID. Half of the participants who took the pre-test then took a Vibey Transcribey home with them along with the training games and spent the next 6 weeks playing the games to learn how to interpret the device. The other participants went home and lived their regular non-Vibey Transcribey lives during that time period. After the training period was over, everybody came back to the lab for a post-test. The post-test procedures were identical to the pre-test procedures, so they also took about 2 hours in person. Thankfully, they was able to complete all of those over a 2-week period. So with those tests, to determine how well participants perceived tactile phonemes, they completed a set of trials that looked like this. First, a single syllable word is vibrated on the Vibey Transcribey. Then 9 choices are presented on the screen. Only one of them matched the vibrated syllable. Participants chose whichever of those options they thought matched the vibrations. And then they would repeat that process 320 times for different combinations of the consonants, vowels, and speakers for each one. To determine how well participants perceived tactile prosody, they completed a set of trials that looked like this. First, a phrase was displayed on the screen as text. Then 2 versions of that phrase were vibrated on the Vibey Transcribey. One vibration matched the text on the screen exactly, while the other vibration was slightly different. As each version was vibrated, the corresponding button on the screen was highlighted to let them know which vibration went to which button. And after the options were done vibrating, the participant chose the button that they felt matched the on-screen phrase. They repeated this process many times for many different phases. I use this procedure to test prosody in 2 different ways. One was to determine whether participants could identify which word in a phrase was emphasized. For example, on the screen, they would see one of these 2 sentences, either Mary likes to read books or Mary likes to read books. Then, after seeing one of those 2 versions, they would feel both versions on their skin and choose the matching one. The other test was for phrase boundaries, where the phrases varied based on where a comma was placed. For example, they either saw after Jane dusts the dining table or after Jane dusts the dining table. Then they would feel both options vibrated and choose which one matched what they saw. For the focus tests, there were 141 trials that they repeated, and for the phrase test, there were 126. There were different phrases that were spoken, and each one was repeated multiple times. Lastly, we wanted to know if the tactile perception of speech integrates with the auditory perception of speech. To test this, first, an auditory syllable is presented on headphones while a different tactile syllable is presented on the Vibey Transcribey. Then we asked participants what they heard. There were 4 options for them to choose from. 1 matched the auditory stimulus, what was played in the headphones. 1 matched the tactile stimulus, what was played on the Vibey Transcribey. And 2 other options, which were a mixture of the other 2 stimuli, indicating if they were chosen, that would indicate perceptual integration. They repeated this 96 times in total. So that's the final component of the pretest, and the post-test again was identical. 12 people participated in this study with a mean age of 35.7 years. 5 identified as female, 6 as male, and 1 as genderqueer. 6 of the participants were assigned to the training group, but 1 was dismissed after not completing any training for multiple weeks. Unfortunately, at that stage, it was too late to replace him with one of the standby participants that I had. All of my participants were right-hand dominant. They were moderate video game players with regular and direct access to a modern gaming PC. They spoke fluent English and no other languages, and they had no language impairments. So how did it go? Well, first let's talk about their training. With regards to that, participants varied greatly in the amount of training that they performed. Some trained only once per week, while others did 2 to 4 sessions per week. Each training session had a mean duration of about 36 minutes. They were asked to train for 2 to 4 hours per week, which would have yielded a minimum of 12 hours each, but only 2 participants really achieved this goal. During the training, participants' reaction to stimuli in the game were judged as either correct or incorrect. I used that trial data with a mixed effects model to determine how well their performance progressed. In this plot, each circle represents 1 participant playing 1 level 1 time. The portion of correct trials during a level attempt was used as the dependent variable in my mixed effects model, and that's what you see in the y-axis. A normalized representation of the individual's attempt on each level was used as the only fixed effect, and that's what you see along the x-axis. A data point at 0.0 means that it was that participant's first time playing that specific level. A data point at 1.0 means it was that participant's final attempt playing that specific level. When they played levels more than twice, the intermediate attempts are equally distributed along the x-axis. Levels that were not attempted at least twice by the participant were not considered in this data set. Also, the size of the data points represents how many trials they performed during that level play. Level attempts with more trials carried more weight in the model. Notice that at 0.0 on their first attempts at each level, most of the data points are above 50%. This is interesting because on the easiest levels in the games, participants had a 50% chance of guessing things correctly, and their chance of guessing correctly only went down from there. This suggests that participants were pretty good at the games right off the bat, since most of the data is above 50%. So, this is best explained by the pregame and pause screen. Before starting a level or anytime the game was paused, participants could preview all of the vibrating words for that level with no limits. So before even really starting a level for the first time, most participants would practice and learn some of the differences between the words before their first playthrough. Another point to make about this data is about the data at 0.0 is how varied the points are vertically versus the data points at 1.0 on their final attempts at the levels, where they're more tightly grouped and higher up on the scale. This seems to suggest that performance improved, but to determine that empirically, I used a mixed effects regression. The best fitting model included random effects for participant and level nested within game. This was done to control for repeated measures and non-independent data. The best fitting model did show a statistically significant effect of level progression on the portion of correct trials. The participants' continued attempts at each level yielded an improvement of about 15% from their first attempt to their last attempt. So yes, as they played the levels more, they improved in their ability to differentiate the tactile words. Now, before I move on from this slide, I want to call your attention back to the table and specifically to the leaders view column. This is a count of how many times each participant viewed the online leaderboard. As you can see, participants viewed the leaderboard multiple times per training session to compare their cumulative scores to the other participants. Besides creating a competitive motivation for participants to train, the leaderboard is also designed to shape the participants' training. In conversational English, some phonemes occur naturally more frequently than others. The training software kept track of how many times each participant was exposed to each individual phoneme. When a participant's training was low on a specific phoneme relative to its prevalence in conversational English, then levels containing that phoneme would be given a point-boosting multiplier. This incentivized players to select those levels where they needed more exposure to the phonemes within that level's training words to better match the distribution of phonemes in conversational English. This plot shows how well that worked. Each bar represents a different phoneme. Values below 100% indicate phonemes that were underrepresented in training versus their prevalence in conversational English. Values above 100% indicate overrepresentation. I perform a chi-square goodness of fit test to determine whether the training frequencies differ significantly from the expected values. The test did show significant difference between distributions, indicating that the distribution of phonemes that participants received did not match the distribution of phonemes in conversational English. Having said that, there's one limitation here, and it's that it would have been better to split the training group into two subgroups, one that received the bonus multiplier incentive as I described it, and the other with randomized bonus multipliers. Then, even if the incentives didn't achieve the parity with conversational English like we hoped, we could have at least seen if it was better than just random boost multipliers. For now, though, we'll have to leave that to a future study. For the rest of the results, we'll be looking at differences in pre-test and post-test results between the control group who received no training and the experimental group who did. We'll also get a little more granular with the post-test data for the training group specifically for each of these tests. Excuse me. The first research question was about phonemic perception. In other words, how well can participants distinguish between the different consonant and vowel sounds when vibrated on the device? On this graph, the dashed line represents an expected value. In this case, chance level performance is 1 out of 9 since the task was essentially a 9-option multiple choice test. We expect the control group to perform at chance level for both the pre-test and the post-test, since at no point in time did they ever make an association between the vibrations and phonemes. And this is what we observe. On the pre-test, the experimental group is also expected to perform at chance level since they hadn't done any training yet. But on the post-test, we theorize an improvement, a higher data point on the vertical axis. Unfortunately, this is not what we observe. The planned test for this is a binary logistic mixed effects model. Trial correctness was modeled as a dependent variable with fixed effects for testing session and group assignment. Participant ID and phoneme were nested within phoneme type were modeled as random effects to account for repeated measures and non-independent data. The best fitting model did not show a significant interaction between training group and testing session. Now, because we know how many times each participant was exposed to each phoneme, we can dig a little bit deeper into the post-test data for our trained participants. Basically, we're going to take this little golden triangle here and put it under a microscope. We already know that the data represented by this point averages out to about chance level, but we also know that for each phoneme, participants received different amounts of training. Some phonemes they experienced a lot, while others had very little exposure. So we theorize that trained participants will do better on phonemes that they have received more training on. This graph shows aggregated phonemes for the 5 trained participants. The x-axis is the average count of exposures for each phoneme across all participants. The y-axis is the average portion of post-test trials that were correct for that phoneme across participants. We expect to see a positive trend among the data here, but we can still dig a little bit deeper because participants chose their own path for training, so their exposure to phonemes were unique. This plot shows the data for each participant in a separate box rather than averaging them all together. We theorize that exposures to a tactile phoneme will yield more correct responses, but to test that mathematically, we use another binary logistic mixed effects model using just the post-test trials from the experimental group. Trial correctness is modeled as the dependent variable, and the normalized count of phoneme exposures is modeled as the single fixed effect. Like before, we model phoneme and participant ID as random effects to account for non-independence. When compared to a basic intercepts model, the phoneme exposures did not improve model fitness, which indicates that no effective training could be measured here either. For prosodic perception, you may recall that we had two tests, focus and phrase boundaries. For the focus test, participants had to identify an emphasized word in a phrase. Like before, we expect the control group to perform at chance level in both pre and post tests, and we expect the experimental group to improve on their post-test data. But what we have looks very similar to our other results. Mathematically, we test this with another mixed effects model like phoneme perception. And like before, we find no significant interaction between group assignment and testing session, indicating no effective training. Our planned tests again include digging deeper into the post-test data for the experimental group, that second golden triangle. For this examination, we theorized that participants who had more training by word count could have more correct responses in the focus detection task. The task for this is another binary logistic mixed effects model with trial correctness as the dependent variable and training word exposure count as the only fixed effect. Again, with random effects model to control for repeated measures. This model also did not indicate a significant effect of training. The other test for prosodic perception was phrase boundary detection, where participants had to determine the position of a comma within a phrase. Using the same statistical procedure as the focus detection test, I again found no indication that training had an effect between groups from pre-test to post-test. Likewise, the deeper dive into the trained group's post-test data showed no significant effect of training. The final test was for perceptual integration, where we theorized that true tactile speech perception would integrate with auditory speech perception. On this task, we expect that before receiving any training, participants will show no signs of tactile auditory perception and perceptual integration with speech. This is indicated by the dashed line at 0%. Initial responses were much higher than expected. An analysis of pretest responses revealed that 3 auditory stimuli were correctly identified on fewer than half of the trials. So all of the trials in both the pre and post-test data using one of those 3 stimuli were removed from the data set and excluded from analysis. This reduced the number of false positives, but as you can see in the graph, there was still some noise present. Our mathematical test for this was a binary logistic mixed effects model, testing for an interaction between group assignment and testing session, with random effects model to account for non-independent data and repeated measures, but like before, training did not have a positive effect that we could observe. Again, like before, we dig deeper into the trained group's post-test data. Here we theorize that more exposure to a tactile consonant will make that consonant more likely to be integrated. This plot shows the tactile syllables used in the test. Each color represents a different participant. The x-axis represents how many times the consonant for that syllable was presented to the participant during training, and the y-axis represents the portion of trials that were counted as integrated. The statistical procedure, again, is a binary logistic mixed effects model. But again, no effective training could be observed in these data. Okay, so what does all of this mean and how does it contribute to the science? This project as a whole had its fair share of successes and failures. I defined a more complete tactile speech encoding that includes both phonemes and prosody. I designed and built devices that rendered tactile speech using that encoding and deployed them to users, and thankfully nobody's PC blew up. I also developed game-based training software for participants to use in their home with those devices. However, I failed to demonstrate the system actually achieving tactile speech perception in any measurable way. I consider each of these, the successes and failures, to be meaningful contributions. A tactile speech system may be more effective, and I argue is only complete if it conveys both phonemes and prosody. This may be just an idea, but in tactile speech research, it is novel, and I hope that future work keeps this in mind. But in addition to that idea, I also contribute my realization of it. I invite anybody to use my encoding or to modify it for their own work. And I don't I don't mean just the design. I also contribute a complete set of Python and shell scripts that implement this design as open source software available freely to anyone, scientists, inventors, tinkerers, etc. By sharing it freely, I hope that others can use it for deeper research and improve or expand upon it. Naturally, this design and my supplied implementation are imperfect. One limitation is that my design spatially maps two distinct features, pitch and phoneme. Independently, these align with previous work. However, together the cues may be conflated. Future work should consider mapping one of these differently. A different body site would be great, but a non-spatial mapping would be even better. One idea would be mapping pitch to frequency modulation, which has been demonstrated in some past work. This would give higher and lower pitched utterances distinct sensations so that they would feel different. Another limitation to this design is that only one phoneme can be rendered at a time, so co-articulation is completely non-existent in this system, whereas it is prominent in auditory speech. Consideration for this would require a new forced alignment tool, as all the ones that I tried in my research did not produce overlapping timestamps. Also, signals in the system are represented at a rate of 1,000 samples per second, which is fast for tactile rendering, but incredibly slow for auditory data. This is especially problematic for short phonemes like plosives, since the actuators need some time to reach their full displacement. Perhaps the biggest flaw in the design is that it can only work on pre-recorded audio. Ideally, someone would be able to wear a device like this and feel speech during a conversation with no perceivable latency between the speaker and the tactile representation. My implementation relies on a pre-existing transcript of the audio, but even if it used an automated speech recognition system, the delay is quite significant. In earlier phases of this project, I did explore other encoding strategies with the specific intention of creating one that would work in real time. I experimented with neural networks, autoencoders, self-organizing maps, and other ideas. Although none worked to my satisfaction, I have more ideas to explore, and there are continuous advancements in automated speech recognition and machine learning that can be applied here. I'm also especially interested in learning more about how languages and writing systems are constructed naturally and how that might inform a better tactile mapping. My use of the funneling effect to create a 2D tactile array is another contribution of this work. But building this device was not a trivial task, at least not for me. I designed an electronic schematic and mapped the schematic to a 2-layer PCB that could then be manufactured and assembled. The electronics were housed in a 3D printed case that I designed and produced myself. The actuators also had a 3D printed housing of my design, which were affixed to the sleeve using 3D printed jigs and guides as aids, also of my design. By putting all of these parts together, I now have 10 Vibey Transcribey devices at disposal for my own future work. But my immediate contribution to the field is that I'm sharing everything necessary for others to build their own Vibey Transcribeys. That includes the electronic schematic and PCB layout, the design files for all of the 3D printed parts and jigs, and the firmware source code for the microcontroller. Again, I hope that by sharing these materials freely, others will be able to create and expand on what I've started here. Naturally, all of that is imperfect as well. For example, my devices use linear resonant actuators. In the universe of vibrating actuators, these are sort of in the middle of the road for both cost and performance. More expensive actuators have faster response times, have finer control over displacement, and have larger maximum displacement values. They can render complex waveforms as well, whereas LRAs have a fixed frequency. Because the fancier actuators, besides the fancier actuators being more expensive themselves, they also require more expensive circuitry to drive them. And I do consider cost to be a paramount consideration for inclusive technologies. But it's often the case that with time, relative costs come down and better actuators may be more viable in the future. Another limitation of the Vibey Transcribey is its reliance on a tactile illusion for its display. One participant reported experiencing the effect between the pitch array and the phoneme array, which was certainly not by design. The body of literature on the funneling effect is small compared to other sensory illusions, but the Vibey Transcribey can be used as an instrument for evaluating some of that work. Although the device itself is relatively simple in its construction, it's not that convenient to put on and take off. Because you wear it on your arm, you can only use one arm to put it on. Participants were given some instruction on how to wear the device so that the actuators would be in the same place each day, but I have no data indicating how accurate or precise that process was. The arm is a popular location for tactile speech research, but other locations should be considered as well. A Vibey Transcribey for your legs, for example, would be more easily worn and removed and perhaps less likely to interfere with things like armrests. The Vibey Transcribers used in this study were tethered to PCs using USB cables. There is hardware and software support for Bluetooth in the Vibey Transcribey, but no considerations have been made for battery power yet. The very first version of the Vibey Transcribey could be paired with a cell phone and integrated with Android's built-in accessibility features. In the future, I'd like to re-implement this again for the newer version of the Vibey Transcribey so that it could be used for more than just these purpose-built training games. Lastly, I chose a knit fabric sleeve for the device. While this helped me achieve a more uniform spacing of actuators despite individual differences in arm sizes and shapes, the sleeves didn't fit that well for everybody. The stretchiness of the fabric seemed to wear out, and some participants indicated that actuators around their wrist didn't have strong contact with their skin by the end of the study. One participant asked for a modification to the sleeve early in the study after experiencing discomfort on their bicep where the sleeve was too tight. This modification is apparent in this image, where the pitch array was relocated to a separate adjustable band. I did collect measurements from participants during recruitment, but foolishly only asked for dimensions of their forearms. With regards to the games, although they were simple, participants did indicate that they enjoyed playing them. They may have been saying that to spare my feelings, but I think anyone who has seen or participated in perceptual learning studies will agree that from a participant's perspective, playing games is much preferred to the standard practice. Like other components of this project, the source code for the training games is made freely available as open source software to the public. The training, of course, had its limitations as well. Firstly, the training consisted entirely of single word comparisons. Participants may have done better if they trained bottom up instead by learning individual phonemes and then building up to words. Alternatively, they may also have done better if they trained on full phrases instead of just words. Organic language acquisition happens through exposure to normal conversation, so it seems reasonable that training on full sentences may yield better results here. Furthermore, this training was exclusively games, and those games were very similar to each other. It may be worth exploring whether other game genres improve the training experience. I think games with a narrative would be especially interesting in this context. Activities other than gaming should be explored too, like watching movies, listening to music, reading books, checking email, etc. Another limitation is that the organization of levels in the games was somewhat arbitrary. It would be great if we could determine a system to organize levels in a way that's conducive to learning this new system. Also, the games did provide some text instruction, but there was no tutorial. Some participants indicated that they didn't understand how to play the soup loop games at first, and it took them a while to figure it out. At least one participant didn't know that you could pause the game and preview all the terms in the middle of a session. Another participant didn't know that there was a dedicated button on the controller to reactivate the last vibrated word. Built-in game tutorials are a natural way to address these issues in future work. Lastly, these games were made using Unreal Engine 4.25. Although the source code to Unreal Engine is available to anyone who registers for it, the license does not meet the requirements to be considered open source software. Proprietary licensing used for software in scientific research is a threat to open science. Furthermore, Unreal Engine is extremely complex, unwieldy, and difficult to master. For these reasons, I don't recommend it for scientific research. And in the future, I'll be moving forward with a project called Godot. It's a feature-rich game engine, which is available freely as open source software under the extremely permissive MIT license. Some of the goals I put forward were extremely ambitious. When I began researching for this project and reading about previous work, I thought I had a clear and complete picture of where previous systems failed. I created a new system and defined new testing requirements, but my system failed these tests. Although participants could differentiate tactile words in their training, none of that learning transferred to their perception of tactile phonemes or tactile prosody, nor were there any signs of perceptual integration. However, this isn't a dead end. There's an entire universe of possibilities for a tactile speech device that does work, and only a few have been tried. This study has merely determined that one specific combination of speech parameters, display dimensions, training method, and duration did not work. But there are many more configurations to explore. Having said that, I want to push forward the idea that future tactile speech perception research include these same tests as a minimum set of validation parameters, rather than just testing participants on the stimuli they trained with. Lastly, as researchers, practitioners, designers, engineers, artists, and makers, the work we do will undoubtedly affect the experiences of others. The steps we take and the steps we don't take can either help or harm. We have an imperative to help create systems, environments, and experiences which do not disable people. A fully inclusive world is certainly a lofty goal, but one way we can expedite the process is by sharing our work openly and freely. To that end, all of the materials I've developed over the past few years for this project are available on the Open Science Framework at osf.io/3f5nu. In addition to what I mentioned earlier, this also includes the software I use for the pre-tests and post-tests, the code used to perform all of the data analysis, the data I collected itself, and all of the stimuli that I created for these experiments. These materials are available to anybody for any purpose, including research, commercial applications, or personal use, so long as their modifications are also made open source. That OSF page also includes this presentation and my manuscript once it's complete. In the interest of the forward progress of science and fewer barriers to more inclusive experiences, I encourage other researchers in this audience to consider using the Open Science Framework to collect and share materials for all of your current and future projects. Thank you for your time today. I will now take any questions.
Okay, good presentation. Questions, please.
Hi, John. Thanks. I guess I'll start. Wow. So let me back up from some
I'm
of the
sorry.
other.
It seems my audio is not working again. 1 second.
Okay.
Do you hear me? Dom, could you hear me?
I thought this was an advertisement for the Vibey
Let me
Transcribey.
switch headphones. Give me
Yeah.
give me just 1 second.
Put it on the forearm. But you need more training than 2 months.
I guess maybe if we.
There we
keep
go.
chat- You got it now?
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay. First of all, thanks. Great job. And I don't know what to say. It's like, wow, okay, so the results are a little disappointing, right? But you can't help that, right? It is
Right.
what it is. What it makes me curious, this kind of goes way back. How did you determine the mappings of where each phoneme would be and how, and did you do any user testing at all on that? Or was it simply just, this is the only way I can make 42 out of the 12 tactors, and so this is the way it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my original intention was to systematically create the mapping based on features of the audio waveform of the different phonemes. So I basically sampled audio in the same way that's done for automated speech recognition, taking 25 millisecond windows with 10 millisecond overlaps, taking a spectrogram of that and computing the FCCs, MFCCs, and then trying to create a mapping based on the similarities between those phonemes. But I literally spent months trying to do that and was unsuccessful in creating one that was reliable. So in the end, what I ended up with was a mapping where I took vowel sounds There's actually, let me pull up a chart. Share my screen again. Not that one, not that one, this one. The consonants are positioned in one place on the array and the vowels are positioned in a different place on the array. The vowels are organized similarly to this chart. This chart shows them organized according to how the vowels are articulated, but this also pretty closely corresponds to how they're perceived. The first two formats in the spectrogram for vowels are the best ways to programmatically identify those sounds. And this chart actually aligns with each one of those formats along a different axis. So this is approximately how the vowels were laid out on the device in this configuration. The consonants were organized based on ones that were most frequently confused with each other. So like M and N, for example, were positioned next to each other, while like M and B were further away from each other.
Okay, thanks.
You also asked if I did any user testing with that, and the answer to that is no.
Yeah, you would have had to build it and rebuild it and build it. Yeah, anyway. So yeah, and I'm going to ask one more and then maybe we can come back, but I want to give other people some time too. So the post-test results are not that exciting, right?
Right.
Not what you'd expect, and yet they demonstrated learning on those. And so I guess I'm just trying to and you don't have to necessarily answer this immediately, but I'm trying to think about what that means in terms of, does gamified learning in general only transfer to other games? And if you test it in a game-like fashion, hey, they can do great. If you test it, if you teach in a gamified fashion and then test in a more traditional one, maybe it doesn't transfer.
Yeah, I don't think that the failure to transfer from their training to the test was a result of the gamification. Rather, I think that it's the result of a different level of perception. So in the games, they're training on whole words and only words, whereas in the tests, they're training on either phonemes or they're training on phrases. So, you know, words kind of fall in the middle of that. If I had tested them on words, then I think they probably would have done well. If I tested them on the same words they trained on, I think they probably would have done well. But
So
I didn't do that.
Yeah, why not? Wouldn't that have been?
Yeah, so the argument that I make is that previous work in tactile speech perception is incomplete because they usually only do that. They train participants on a set of stimuli, and then they test them on that same set of stimuli. Rather than training them on phonemes and then testing them on words, or training them on words and then testing them on phonemes, they only test them on the same thing that they trained them on. And I mean, just honestly, that's not that impressive to me. I suppose for a dissertation, it probably would have been good to demonstrate that empirically, but I don't think that that's a valid demonstration of true tactile speech perception.
Clearly
that's just
it's
single
not.
modality sensory experience.
Yeah, clearly it's not. And yet I think about like how we acquire language, and this is almost like acquiring a new one. We don't jump from learning phonemes to recognizing phrases, right? We do progress into, yeah, anyway, I'll stop now and let somebody else have a shot, but thanks.
Thank you for your questions.
Dom, I'd like to kind of touch base or stay with that same fact about, so you had said something about that stringing language together is how we learn it, but if we don't have the vocabulary, we don't string it together, and we don't string it together very quickly. So going back to that word level, I would think would be pretty important. And also, I have problems with thinking that gaming, when you're paying attention to the game itself, doesn't allow the person to focus their attention on where that placement on the vibrotactile response might be. And because attention is a big part of language learning, you know, we have to perceive it, but we also have to pay attention and have attention there. So I'm wondering if while they're playing the game, they're not attending to the task enough to, in a post-test situation, really have learned anything because of that lack of attention.
Yeah, that's a great point. So one feature that I had built into the game is that after they interacted with the environment and felt a word vibrate on their arm, they could repeat that word by pressing a button on their gamepad as many times as they needed before they had to react to that word. So while playing the game, they would feel the vibration. They could stop at any moment and experience that vibration again and again and again, as many times as they felt was necessary before they could decide whether or not they thought they knew what that word was. I did collect data during their training on how many times each word was vibrated. So I can actually dig in and see how frequently people did that. I don't have that analysis right now, but I can tell you anecdotally, when I was playing the games myself, especially on brand new levels, I would vibrate each word at least 4 or 5 times before I actually performed an action based on that word. I think your concern about balancing different tasks in a gaming environment is a valid one, but these games were very simple. They pretty much had one task in each game, and it was to identify the word that was being vibrated. And they could, at any point while playing the games, they could take a moment to experience the words over and over so that they could try to elucidate what was being vibrated to them.
Well, I'd like to see, how many actually did. And you said, yes, you did each word several times.
Mm-hmm.
But if some of them weren't even aware of certain features of the game, and some of them might not have had the appreciation or the motivation that you had to get those sounds, and motivation and attention are all part of it. So
absolutely,
it would be interesting to see how many times they did actually repeat it and not get caught up in the gaming process of it.
Yeah, I can dig into the data, and I can share that with you.
And the last thing that I want to say, and I'm gonna let someone else ask questions. So these IPA vowel charts, speech, language, hearing, it's our big world. But you mentioned in the previous meeting that we had tonotopic organization. So my question for you is, why did you drop that from the sleeve?
I didn't.
Okay.
Let me scroll to here. Actually, that's not a great one. This is better. The pitch was mapped tonotopically. So the phonemes were mapped symbolically, with some consideration given to the IPA vowel chart and then confusion matrix for the consonants, but the pitches were mapped tonotopically on the bicep. So
are they feeling both where a vowel sound would be or a consonant sound and the pitch at the same time?
Simultaneously, yeah.
Okay.
And it was all in with the same timing as the actual speech. So I took actual recorded speech of the words and converted that into the vibration, so they would feel them, at the same speed and pace as an actual spoken word.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe I can follow up because I had actually a very similar question. So I think, as I mentioned before, fantastic work.
Thank you.
I just wanted to follow up on the participants in terms of are gamers the best participants for this? And the reason I think you kind of mentioned, so what I'm a little bit worried about is, one, the game may not have been as motivating for them or challenging. Remember, gamers are always trying to challenge themselves. And maybe your game was too simple that they'll kind of were maybe not paying it enough attention, because again, gamers are trying to maximize all their senses and try to do the best at this game. And in this game was maybe too simple for them. And I don't know if you tried evaluating that in some way, like did they report something at the end? Okay, I tried, but maybe I was not motivated enough or something like that.
I do have some data from participants about what parts of the games they enjoyed and what parts of the games they didn't enjoy. But to answer your question about why gamers and are gamers the right population, the reason why I use gamers is because the training games required the users to have a gaming PC, which meant that everybody doing the training was probably going to be a gamer. And because I didn't want that to be a confounding variable with my control group participants, I made sure that everybody in my study was at least some level of identified to be some type of gamer.
Okay, yeah, so maybe in future or in your dissertation in the future work, it could be mentioned where you provide a gaming PC as part of the evaluation, and then you could test with non-gamers as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, also, you know, a simpler game than the ones that I made. You know, I made these 3D games. You know, there could be different games that would be simpler and easier to run on, you know, any PC. I think a requirement that people have a PC is probably much easier to satisfy than asking people to have a gaming PC.
Right.
So yeah,
right.
there are definitely some options there to expand the population of potential participants.
And I think the second and kind of related question is, I was again thinking that would hearing impaired users be a better population to have tested this on, because they are really motivated? Again, going back to the motivation, because you can show them what the word was, give them training, and then they perhaps listen to this using Vibey Transcribey and then play the game. And I'm just curious if you thought that direction.
Yes, absolutely. 2 points to make about that. The first is that there is a much smaller population of people in the deaf community. So I had a somewhat difficult time recruiting participants for this study in the first place. I think if I added another requirement that people be deaf or hard of hearing, would have probably made it nearly impossible for me to collect enough participants to actually do what I did. The second point is that I want to design experiences that work for all people and not just ones that are you know, afterthoughts or special concessions made for special populations. I think that in the world of inclusive design, the best work is that which benefits all people.
Right. So yeah, I agree with that point. The only thing is, when in your conclusions, when you say that you couldn't demonstrate, I was thinking maybe those participants would have increased the probability that maybe there would have been a more correlation shown, or your results would have improved. And then people could have thought about inclusion and things like that. Right now, perhaps I guess the more important pressing need was to demonstrate that your system actually has significant benefits, right? But again, I see your point and the challenge, but maybe something in future work again, like where
Certainly.
people could expand.
Yeah, I think, you know, ultimately, work in this field necessarily will include all populations in its research pool. You know, at this stage, though, with so few participants in the study, it was important for me to actually exclude those people so that I could guarantee that I had a homogeneous pool of participants that were actually being examined, rather than having to worry about, you know, confounding factors between the participants. But yeah, I totally agree. In the future, you know, as this work continues, you know, including all populations in the design of the research will be important. Absolutely.
Okay, yeah, I think that's all I had. In general, I feel sometimes older adults are more patient and might actually be better participants. And maybe some of your demographic seemed a bit younger, and maybe that's what the demographic of the gamers are. But again, that's something I feel maybe, at least in my interactions, I noticed the older people or adults are more patient in listening, and maybe the younger folks are more impulsive.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's certainly something to consider as well.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps I can ask some questions. So the first question I have is kind of more detailed. So can you go back to your slides on the perceptual integration results? You
Yes.
test for the Gestalt, McGurk effects. So, I mean, if I look at this graph on the left side, it seems to me, I mean, there is a decrease in the integration following training for the experimental group. Although I know you said that this is not significant, right? So, but I mean, there seems to be a decrease. If it's not significant, that might be due to insufficient statistical power because you only have like 4 participants. So I'm just trying to think, what does this mean if these effects is real?
Yeah. So two points to make about this particular graph. One is that the stimuli that I used for this came from some previously published work where they shared their stimuli. I mentioned during the presentation that some of the auditory stimuli were simply just easily confused for others. You know, although these stimuli were used in previous work, I think that the quality of the stimuli maybe weren't as good as it could have been. So just, you know, just the fact that people were picking responses without having received any training, you know, having never worn the device before, they're showing signs of perceptual integration, and that doesn't make any sense. And the reason for that is because some of the auditory stimuli were just easily confused for other syllables. I made an attempt at cleaning up the data prior to analysis, but I mean, you can still see here, you know, 20% integration rate for an entirely new sensory experience is completely unexpected. So some of that is just noise. The other point is that the data that you see here in the graph is aggregated data, and I didn't use the aggregated data for the actual statistical procedure. This graph, well, I guess I don't actually have that graph in this deck. But the short answer is this one actually, you know, kind of demonstrates it well enough anyway. I didn't do a regular linear regression like that graph, the previous graph would suggest. I did a binary logistic regression using the individual trials on the tests as the records for examination. So instead of fitting a linear line, just, you know, a straight line between the data points, I'm trying to fit a curved logistic line, the logit function between these points. So even though you're right, this plot would suggest that some interaction has occurred, this plot doesn't actually fully represent the data as it was computed through the statistical model.
Yeah, but still, I mean, this difference seems to be kind of large as shown on this graph. I mean, there is a decrease for the experimental group. Yeah, so but I guess your answer makes sense. Another question I have, it's kind of similar to what Carol has mentioned, because I mean, ideally you should have placed these nodes in groups. So basically, these similar phonemes, they should be positioned together in space, right? So it seems I would say that might make the training much easier for participants, because similar phonemes are positioned closer together in the arm. So actually, I think your task is really a very high precision task because you have like so many phonemes to distinguish between. And I guess one reason, perhaps why you got non-significant results for your first experiments, for example, is because of the way you test the functions. So I know you used the 9 first choice task. Is that correct?
Mhm.
Nine first, multiple first
Yeah,
choice.
nine alternative first choice tasks.
Right. That seems to be a really difficult task to me. I haven't seen much many studies using as many as that alternatives. So, for instance, if you look into your data, if you can see if some of these choices are actually more similar than other choices. So, for instance, some response they are determined as a wrong response, perhaps because they actually have chose a similar enough response, but not the exact one. Instead of like, because I don't know how you choose these 9 alternatives. So you see what I mean? So this is really, I mean, a very precision task, a high precision task. So if you can, for instance, divide the responses into several groups based on the similarity of alternatives.
I think it would be interesting to compute like a confusion matrix of the responses to see exactly if there were some phonemes in the test data where people were regularly selecting one particular phoneme when they were presented with a different one. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to try to compute a confusion matrix for that data. I don't expect that it would demonstrate what you're suggesting. I think it probably would basically be random, but it would be nice to actually visualize that in a confusion matrix to see.
Yeah, it would definitely be interesting to see if there's some clustering of responses. Because this is really a high precision task. I mean, particularly considering that your training is actually very limited. I mean, for such a complex task, actually, your training is very limited. I mean, you say that the maximum is like 12 hours. Most of your participants can actually achieve that amount of training.
Right.
But I do, because based on your progression data, right? Progress data, actually, they showed some sort of improvement. It's just that this improvement is not reflected in your poster test. So I guess there might be some way that you can reveal that there's actually some learning in after training.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I guess the last question, yeah, is kind of technology, more technical. So I assume you are running experiments in VR. Is that correct?
No.
Virtual reality? No, because you mentioned the kind of engines.
So I used a game engine to make the training games, but the pretest and post-tests it was just Python, just with a simple, graphical user interface. I think he may have frozen.
Ken, are you muted?
No, I think I was cut out. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know if you heard my response, but the training games were in a 3D environment, but the evaluations were not. The evaluations were it was just a 2-dimensional graphical user interface.
But by 3D environment, do you mean virtual reality or?
No, I mean, this is what the games looked like on the monitor. So they played the games on regular computer monitors with a gamepad.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to know, what exactly did. Yeah, because I'm kind of thinking there might be some interference between the way the participants has to respond to the game with their perception of the tactile patterns on their arms. If they have to use their arms a lot to interact with the game.
Oh, right. Yeah. They used a gamepad while they were playing the games. And then in the pre-test and post-test, they also use the same gamepad for selecting their responses there. So the response mechanism, both in the game and in the test, was the same.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'll let other people talk.
Brandon, do you have any questions for them?
Yeah, I've got some questions. First of all, Dom, I mean, this is magnificent. This is just a great project. This is what a dissertation should be. I'm sorry the results weren't as exciting as we'd hoped. I think that statistically everything you did is fine. I don't have any problem with your analyses. Did you look at the participants individually, just eyeball pre-post? Because it really looked like there was huge differences in dosage. Participant 2, I mean, from looking at these results, it looks like participant 2 had about 5 times as much dosage in the game as, say, participant 0.
Yeah, participant 2 was my rock star. They were very diligent in playing the games, and they were highly motivated by the online leaderboard. But yeah, with regards to looking at the individual differences between participants, in all of the statistical analyses that I performed, I included the participant ID as a random effect to control for that. Yeah, like you said, it didn't make a difference.
Okay, I think it might be beneficial just to think of this as case studies where, if you're only running 5 people, maybe participant 2 shows differences. I mean, for sometimes in treatment studies, people will just show means and eyeball means and say, it looks like this person made some progress, even though statistically it washes out because some of the other folks didn't do quite as much work.
Right. Yeah. When I planned all the statistical procedures for this, I was working under the assumption that, that 12 hours was going to be the least amount of training that all of my participants would have completed and not the maximum amount of training that my participants had completed. So, with more training, the data would maybe have looked differently, but at this point, it just is what it is. Yeah.
Additionally, I may be misremembering this, but in your proposal meeting, I thought we discussed that gaming data could be pulled. So did the participants get faster as they played more sessions? Did they become more accurate as they played more sessions? Are those data available?
So the only data on that I presented here today was that very first result. This data, this graph here, comes from their training sessions. So each dot, each circle here is a participant playing a training level. I do have other data from their training sessions, but this is the only one that I analyzed. This is the only data that that and their leaderboard views.
Okay. Yeah, I think in terms of, publication, this is perfect as a dissertation, but in terms of publication, it might be, easier to get this information out there. If you could, demonstrate some kind of growth, and I'm guessing that would be the way to do it. That's my main 2 at-large questions.
Okay,
Well,
now it's my turn. Yeah, thank you everyone for raising the great questions, and I agree with all of them. And I would like to make a few comments, not necessarily as a question. For example, like Vinod asked about the game difficulty, how challenging could it be, whether you should make it easier or even more challenging. I'm not sure whether you guys have played or noticed. Recently, there is a very popular, very simple game, but very, very challenging. There are only 2 levels. Level 1 is called Sheep and Sheep on TikTok. Okay, and the first level is so easy, but level 2 is like health level. Okay, most of the time you won't be able to arrive at the 80%. Okay, and then you failed. But this one is there are only 2 levels, and every day there are millions of people playing the same simple game and just want to see whether they can finish it or complete it. So in terms of task difficulty, maybe the challenging task is one attractive point.
Yeah, I think what Dr. Nambadiri was really saying though is that you're right that there are, you know, there are a ton of casual games that exist out there for people who aren't as serious about you know, getting sweaty while they're playing video games. But I specifically recruited people who identify as gamers. And his question, I think, was this type of game appropriate for these types of gamers? And I think that's a valid question. I think your point is also valid, though, that there, you know, is a variety of games and gamers out there. And I think it's important that the future work makes an effort to try to match the training style to personal preferences. If you know, game-based training is going to be pursued further, I think that is an important point.
Yeah, and another great question that is raised by Vina is, well, that's more like a suggestion. So in combining that suggestion with Brandon's question, it's like, well, in the future research, if you could recruit 1 or even 2 deaf people who are so dedicated and motivated, who agree to put on the sleeve for like months and at least playing or using that device for hours per day. So using the Android device or other smartphone-based device like you described in the discussion, which will allow them to get exposed to the natural language environment. So that the amount of dosage or exposure will be more similar to the natural language acquisition as we take a lesson learning another language, right?
Yeah, you know, my vision for this technology is that eventually it will progress to the point where it does operate in real time, and people will be able to wear the device and basically use it passively. That it would function, you know, like a hearing aid would, or you know, that they wouldn't be doing, you know, any task specifically for the device. They would just be doing their activities of daily living and receiving tactile speech passively.
Yeah,
but that's, you know, maybe 50 years down the road, who knows?
Yes, and I think everyone on the committee agrees this is really a valuable project, and everyone expects to see some, you know, no matter how small the effect is, but something significant. But at the same time, and just as Brandon pointed out, this should be what a dissertation look like. You know, it could be a little bit ambitious, but it is so valuable, and it usually tackles on something that is so innovative and so useful, so beneficial in the real world. And I think the work it did usually meet the mission of psychology and human factors to apply the knowledge of cognition, including perceptual learning and cognitive learning, into solving a real world problem. I think that's really the merit of this dissertation. But then again, for your future research, I think it could be done more systematically. In other words, this project has the potential, but in order to realize the potential, you might need to dedicate a decade or even more time to really solve this problem to benefit the broader population, right? Everyone.
Yeah. So next step, get funded.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and even if you think from a clinical perspective, Dom, take out the gaming, because for the hearing impaired, the profoundly hearing impaired, not necessarily just the hard of hearing, but the profoundly hearing impaired, this truly could be game changing for them. And I would like to see if true training, like therapeutic training, rather than the gamification, could show that there are differences pre and post with the stimulation that you've developed. Because yes, in real life, if they are wearing a hearing aid or a cochlear implant or something like that, but in addition, they're getting the prosody cues and everything else tactily, that's pretty important from just a real life perspective for the hearing impaired.
Yeah, if I'll just throw this out there. If you're interested in a future collaboration, I would be very interested in doing that with you.
I would love that. Sounds good to me. And can I ask one last question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So when you said at the beginning that these participants had no language impairment, my first question is, how did you determine that? And also, how did you determine that they didn't have any hearing impairment?
I asked them to self-identify.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Or self-disclose rather. I didn't perform any type of, test procedure to determine, their ability to hear or any language skills. I simply had them identify themselves.
Okay. And just know that, some people aren't aware that they have hearing impairment, and that some people aren't even aware that they have phonemic disabilities. So that's something that you might want to consider ruling out for any future phonemic awareness. If they don't realize that they have that trouble, then they couldn't tell you what the sound is anyway. So just a suggestion.
Okay, so those are the questions from the committee members. For the audience, we have time, I think 5 minutes for the questions from the audience. Okay, if no questions, the committee members are going to join a separate breakout room named committee. I hope I typed it right. Okay, could you guys go ahead to join the room? There are so many people, so many participants. Be hard for me to select one by one. I can do that, but you could go ahead to join it by yourself. Okay.
So Ray, where do we join it?
Yeah, I don't see a way to join.
There's a committee. I will select you guys and assign you guys into it. Give me a second. And now, Dom, could you turn off the recording?
Yeah.
Alrighty. After discussions of the committee members, the committee made the following recommendation: to approve the defense and recommend you to make a clean version and send it to the committee member by the end of this week, and approve the dissertation document. Yeah, congratulations.
Hey, congrats.
Dr.
Yay!
Yay!
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah.
This has been a
What do you want to
very
say,
long
Dom?
journey, and I appreciate everybody's support over all of this time, and your support today as well. It means a lot.
You've done a very good job. We're impressed.
Thank you.
Very nice. Yeah.
Wonderful job.
Yeah. I'm not sure it is traditional, but Ross is here today. Is Ross still around?
Yeah, she's here.
Yeah. Ross, do you want to speak a little bit about this at this important moment?
Yeah, Ross, you want to say some words?
Sure, it's been quite a journey with Dom, and really incredible seeing all the iterations of the device over the years. I appreciate that I've got to be part of it. That was my sexy arm in some of those pictures. But it's really been great watching the project grow. And Dom does some pretty amazing work. I'm very proud.
Thank you. I do have in my manuscript, I do have a dedication and some acknowledgements that do include Roz. I didn't include them in my slide deck because when I was rehearsing, I couldn't get through those slides without crying, and I didn't want to cry on camera today. So they're in the paper, but they weren't in the slide deck today.
Yeah, Dom, I feel so happy for you. It's a major achievement and a milestone, but also it cannot be achieved by just yourself. And I really feel happy for both you and Ross, and for so many years of supporting each other. And please keep doing that. Yeah. Good job.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you for coming to the defense from Dom. Now, Dr. Nair. And again, if there are any questions, feel free to email me and Dom, and we are looking forward to receiving the final document. And good job. Have the best of the rest of the week and the day. Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.